This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Welcome to the Friday morning break with John Gibbs here on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week, Professor Shana Carpenter from Oregon State University. We are going to discuss the science of learning, pre-questioning, and techniques to enhance recall.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
What are schools for? Well, I remember many years ago being asked by someone what exactly I did. I said, well, it's quite simple, really. I know things, I tell the students, and then they know them. Well, if it were that simple, it would be wonderful. And indeed, simply transferring knowledge doesn't really explain all that schools do or teachers do at all, really. But it's certainly, as my guest and I agreed today, a universal factor in what we do. Schools deliver skills and knowledge, and memory and retaining memory and learning how to remember things is clearly quite important. So in today's discussion, we range over how you learn, how you retain knowledge, how you test knowledge properly, and in what environments you can retain information. And we're back with my guest, Professor Shana Carpenter from Oregon State University. Shana, welcome to Teachers Talk Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as my listeners will know, that always sounds very pretentious when I say that, but actually we have a very large audience of teachers who listen on a Friday morning and listen at other times to this cast. And as my listeners will know, I'm trying to explore what education is for, in a way, what schools are for. You're an expert in retrieval practice. And I know you've written, and by the way, I'm very impressed. I managed to go to your website and saw your CV, which then has a section called Publications, which went on for several pages. So clearly you've written a great deal and you're quite an expert on learning, retrieval practice, and pre-learning testing. Now, have I got that right? Pre-learning testing?
Call it that, pre-testing or pre-questioning, other names that it goes by, but same idea. Exactly. Yeah.
And I think when we spoke before a couple of weeks ago, I said at first, it doesn't appear to be something that sounds very sensible, testing people on things they don't yet know. But the more I thought about it, the more I read some of your work, the more I realized that, well, of course, it seems to be very compliant with the way we learn. In other words, when you set out in the direction of learning something, you have an idea of what it is you wish to learn by identifying what you don't know already. If that makes sense. And I think it does make a certain sense. Am I getting that right about what we're talking about here?
Right. That would be a logical way to approach learning, is to have a goal. What is it that I want to learn and know? And in order to get there, a good way to start is to figure out what you do know and don't know from the beginning, so that you know what to focus on.
Yeah. It's saying when you set about learning something and you say, first of all, I look at the end objective. Now, I know one of the things I've seen you've been on another podcast where you talked about effective teaching and the science of effective teaching. One thing I thought would be a good start, before we get back to what I've just started with, really, I want to start at the very beginning and say, is there a science to effective teaching? And could we start with a definition of what you think effective teaching is?
Yeah, great question. There's definitely a science to effective learning. Think about the process of how we acquire and learn new knowledge and skills, and what's going on in the brain, what's going on with the experience of learning. There's quite a prescriptive approach that's based on scientific principles about how to learn something effectively. Part of teaching is learning. We want our students to learn. Many other facets go into teaching, of course. The learning aspect of it is something that, if we think about it from a perspective of what is the best, most effective way to learn something, that does translate into how we teach it to students. Yeah.
When we talk about learning, a very maybe ancient way of thinking about schools and learning is to say it's the transfer of knowledge. Yeah, I know something, I'm the expert. You're going to know this by the end of this, or it's a transfer of skills, a transfer of information. Schools clearly are a lot more than that. There are all sorts of things going on to do with socialization and awareness of values and attitudes and so on that schools are involved in. But that's at the heart of it, an awful lot of education is simply that transfer, successfully giving people an understanding or knowledge of something that they retain. That'd be a fair definition.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. The multifaceted nature of schools, you hit the nail on the head exactly about that. If we take and we just kind of zoom in on content knowledge and skills and transferability of knowledge that we've learned, how to use information, how to learn something effectively, that part of the mission of education and of schools is something we can approach from a very scientific basis. And we can know, for example, effective ways to learn something that based on, as I say, what's going on in the brain, what's going on with the processes and the mechanisms. And that translates directly into strategies that a teacher can do in the classroom that can directly engage students, and activities and approaches where if students work on a particular type of task that's fully aligned with those processes, it is going to improve their learning. And so you mentioned the pre-questioning or the pre-testing.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's a great example. And these processes, these activities that promote learning, one of the most interesting things about them is that they're not particularly intuitive. As you said, why give students a test before they've learned something?
Yes.
They're not going to know the answers. Yes, that's exactly right. And sometimes students will say, why are you asking me about this stuff that I haven't learned yet? That's an interesting question. And the reason that asking students questions before they've learned something is so effective is because it makes it crystal clear to them what they know and what they don't know about what they are about to embark on learning. And sometimes students are surprised to learn maybe they do know a little bit about this topic that they weren't aware of, because we don't usually do a pre-test or a pre-questioning. Sometimes we do. And sometimes that's a matter of, a teacher may want to see, okay, what do my students know about this, so that I can teach them in particular ways, focusing on what they don't know. But the fact that process, an activity of answering questions, is a learning experience in itself, is something that I didn't think about before I started doing research on this.
Does the research suggest that's the pre-questioning? You've done that, it has to be done in a certain way. You have to learn how to do it properly so that you don't cause a reaction among the students. They don't like it, they feel intimidated, or they're put off a subject.
Yeah, that's a good question. The pre-questioning and also retrieval practice, as you mentioned, using questions as a method to help students learn is absolutely effective. The main reason being it helps them to practice knowing what's already in their knowledge and what's not. Whether those questions come right at the beginning of a learning experience, which is kind of I call it the learning reality check, where it's a very salient, very clear experience for students where maybe there is a reaction sometimes where they feel like, oh, I don't know any of this. And they get kind of discouraged. They feel they want to do well on a quiz or a test. And so not knowing the material can be sort of an emotional reaction sometimes. But think about that for us compared to a situation where students come to class, they are involved in a lesson and they listen to the teacher for days and days. They never have that reality check. They sit and they think, oh, I've got this. This is so easy. This is making sense. Yeah. And then they go to the exam, and that's the first reality check where they say, oh, I thought I knew this so well, and I didn't know it as well as I thought I did. And maybe you ask them why. Well, because it made so much sense when my teacher explained it, and they never had a chance to retrieve from their own memory that knowledge. And so things are so intuitive if you are just passively sitting in the classroom, and your expert teacher, of course, knows the material and is very fluent and seamless and knowledgeable, but to put on the student that accountability of what do you really know about this? And to do more than ask them, is this making sense? Do you know this? And you're going to get everybody nodding. Yes, 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 of course, because they really feel like it is learned. But then you give them the questions to directly test what's learned. And often they're surprised to find out, oh, I didn't understand this as well as I thought I did. But if you use those questions as a practice opportunity, that's a low stakes, very good way to check knowledge so that then more can be done to focus on what's not known, or perhaps what was misunderstood or not learned as effectively as the students thought it was learned. So yes, it's an experience. Nobody likes to get questions wrong on a quiz or on a test. But if this is approached in a way where the students understand this is practice, this is teaching, how much knowledge you have and how you're understanding so that we can move forward and see where we need to tailor the instruction and the teaching to make sure you understand as well as possible all of these concepts.
And that's a good moment for us to take a short break as we listen to a message from the sponsor of Teachers Talk Radio. You're listening to the Friday morning break from Teachers Talk Radio with John Gibbs. And my guest this week is Dr. Shana Carpenter from Oregon State University. And we are discussing the science of learning. Join us again after this short message.
Empowering education with Easy4U, where innovation meets accessibility. Our subscription-based offering not only equips schools with cutting-edge devices, but revolutionizes the learning experience by eliminating financial barriers, streamlining support, and embracing technology. We're not just providing tools, we're shaping a future where every student can thrive, unburdened by limitations. Easy4U, transforming education, one device at a time. Find out more at www.easy4u.school.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Reading Solutions UK. Are you looking for best practices and innovative strategies to foster confident, lifelong readers? Join the free online International Reading Conference on the 11th, 12th and 13th of June. Hear from speakers like TV personality and education expert Basit Siddiqui, beloved children's author Michael Rosen, fluency expert Tim Rosinski, EEF specialist Chloe Butlin, the National Literacy Trust's Irene Picton, and a range of experienced practitioners, including MAT leaders, deputy heads, heads of English, high-level teaching assistants, and school librarians. Through the 3-day conference, speakers will explore a range of topics at the forefront of the current educational landscape, with sessions relevant for all educators and key stages. Visit Reading Solutions at readingsolutionsuk.co.uk for more information and to sign up for this free conference.
as I said at the beginning, Shana, you're based in Oregon, in Corvallis in Oregon, in the USA. It's a bit different in the American system. As far as I remember it, there's a great deal more teacher assessment, school assessment in the classroom as you move through. So does that mean that, in a sense, what you're describing is more suited to the American system?
It's a good question. I think systems definitely have their differences. They have some similarities as well across countries, across areas of the world. One thing that does seem like it's a commonality across these systems is the requirement for students to know stuff.
Yes.
We want them to know whether the exams are, external exams or internal within the classroom, within the school. Interestingly, often we think of the purpose of these exams is to evaluate students. And that's part of why I think exams are so stressful for students. They prepare for these exams. They know these exams are coming. Nobody wants to do exams. At least not any student I've ever spoken with really just loves these exams. And so part of the research that I do and that others do about these using questions as part of the learning process is taking that stressful, scary part of questions and making it more low stakes or no stakes or an activity that itself is preparation and part of the learning process. And understanding that questions are the best way to test your own learning before you get to those high stakes exams that can be so stressful. The way I think about this a lot of the times is if the goal is to do well on these high stakes exams, you have to practice what you will be doing on those high stakes exams. So using questions as a way to just kind of practice or train, you could say, to use an athletic analogy, is kind of like practicing exactly what it is you're going to be doing on the day when you have to demonstrate that you have that knowledge. Using practice questions to learn is because those are the same types of activities you'll do one day for the thing you're preparing for, is kind of like training to run a marathon. You have to run. You have to move your body and train it in a way for the very activity that you're planning to do someday.
Yes.
I think many times in education, what some folks do instead, sort of the default is to, as I said, go to class and just listen and take it in, but passively just listening or not participating in these retrieval opportunities is like training to run a marathon by watching other people train to run a marathon. And then you're not prepared because you haven't done it.
So I'm thinking of the kind of experience we might have all had where you've watched some very interesting thing on the internet, maybe a YouTube lecture or something, where you've attended a lecture. You say, oh, it's absolutely marvelous, wonderful lecture. And then someone said, well, you try to explain it to somebody else and realize that you didn't fully get it.
That's right.
That indeed, you said, well, I understood it when he said it, So in that sense, of course, reflecting on what you've learned exposes how much you actually did take in. I think one of the best ways of learning anything is to try and teach it to somebody else.
That's right.
I'm sure teachers listening to this will say, well, a technique you can use, of course, is simply say, right, now explain that back to me, or now explain that to somebody else.
Yeah. And that's incredibly hard to do, even for us who are older, who have been professional learners, so to speak. The reality check, as I call it, of really understanding how well you know something because you are sort of put into the hot seat, so to speak, and you have to talk about it or explain it or recall it from memory. Everybody has an experience where that is much harder than they predicted it would be. And as you say, best way to learn anything, because that's what reveals to you truly how well you understand something. And learning is not an automatic, easy process. That's something that is a good thing for students to be aware of. You don't automatically absorb knowledge just because somebody said it to you. That's just the beginning. That's your introduction to the knowledge. And then you practice recalling it, really reflecting on it, working with it. And then over time, with enough of that, you forget some stuff and then you go back again and you kind of work with it again and recall it. It's a slow process. Nobody gets it right all the time. And learning about the process of learning and helping students understand to expect some bumps in the road and how
Yes.
it's not easy. It's not automatic. I think is really part of the process that's very important because then they don't feel so discouraged when they get something wrong or when they think, oh, I've been trying at this for 3 weeks now. It's hard. I'm not getting it. That's so normal for learning. And that's part of what this method of questioning does. It shows them that that's quite normal. And that's what we're working through when we're learning stuff.
And I can tell from the way you're describing this, that you're describing a way of learning which is exhilarating, which is fun, which is difficult but fun. I mean, lots of things in life are difficult, but when you look back on them, you enjoy them. And you've overcome the difficulty in it. A few moments ago, when an earlier comment you made a distinction between kind of assessment, the kind of exam there at the end of the course. It's quite intimidating. You're quite frightened of it. You don't want to take that exam, really, if you could possibly get out of it. And then there's the learning process as it is, the dialogue that's taking place in class, the discussion, and you're learning in that. So in a sense, getting that balance right in schools is important between not allowing it to become something that is intimidating, is all about serving the interests of some kind of assessment, and remembering it's also about learning. Is that a useful distinction between the difference between learning and assessment in that way?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Learning, I think, is a lot. When you start to really unpack what is involved in learning, what exactly is this process? Really, the reality of it is learning is never done. It's never finished. It's a process that is often messy, to use a word that we don't often think about with learning. And so I think we traditionally have often thought of learning as this clean, tidy little process where it's like, okay, today I taught my class about fractions and we did some multiplication of fractions. So they've learned fractions. We're going to move on and do this and do this. And then the assessment is sort of like another category where now I want to see how well they've learned fractions. And so I'll give them this test over fractions. And I'm speaking in generalities here. I'm not, this is sort of a historical way of just kind of organizing how we approach learning and classes and how to organize our time within schools. And so very, very generally speaking, I think that's kind of the intuitive way that we've often thought about it. Now, I'm going to make a wild claim here that assessment is part of learning, is a process that begins when you decide that this is going to begin. I'm going to learn about fractions today. And it starts with reading about it, hearing about it, practicing through some practice problems, reflecting on it, getting it wrong, going back to it again, thinking about it. The assessment itself is part of the learning process. Long-term learning, which is really the learning that's durable, that lasts over time, is constantly a changing, dynamic process that can't really be put into a nice, clean, neat timeline. Right now, we have to do assessments. We've been talking about, we can't just say, oh, they're learning. Okay, let's just say that they've learned. So assessments are always going to be part of education. But learning it's an interesting way that we think about learning and how it really works.
And Shona, I really like your description of learning as being messy and unfinished and open-ended. And there is a collision sometimes between that and the end of course assessment, which is going to, many over the years I've talked to students who've said, oh, I revised and revised for that test, but the thing I revised didn't come up. Or they asked me a question that didn't come up. Or they feel that they knew so much and yet the exam was only an hour long. And they say, well, we studied for a whole year and 90% of the course was not even the assessment. I think, well, yes. And that in a sense is the way in which you can feel cheated by the end of assessment, because the assessment becomes a purpose in itself. Whereas learning is an open-ended purpose. It's for you. So in that sense, assessment for learning, which is a phrase British teachers would be familiar with, is, assessment during the process of learning, monitoring learning, feedback to students. All these things are absolutely, as you say, essential to the organic nature of learning. The exams, sometimes I think, can be quite harsh and limiting so that in the end, you're learning for the assessment rather than assessment for learning, which is a bit of as anyone listening to this will know, it's a thing I don't like. I don't really like exams. I taught in a very exam-based system, and lots of my career was based on getting students ready for exams. And looking back on it, I think learning was so wonderful. But the assessment at the end, if I can think of as terminal exams, was often quite a tail wagging the dog. In other words, teaching resulted. You always had your eye on what skills you needed to pass that test, as opposed to how you learn, which was going to be messy and open-ended and exploratory and never end, which I hope is true of most people in their lives.
Yeah, it's an interesting how to effectively assess in a fair way that gives credit to what students have truly learned is a question in itself that has been talked about and debated. And I agree with you. I don't like exams either. I don't like them as a teacher. I don't like them. I think for all of these reasons, and also for the way that anytime there's an assessment to test or to evaluate, you do miss some things because you can't write an assessment that is absolutely fair to everybody and all of the variety of ways that they've learned different things and how they can transfer it and how they can use it. So you miss some things. It's like taking a thin slice of what they have learned, and because they count for so much and they're so high stakes, that's what adds to the pressure and becomes this daunting source of great anxiety a lot of times for students.
You're listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this week, Professor Shana Carpenter from Oregon State University. We're discussing the science of learning. Join us again after a short break for the Teachers Talk Radio news.
Empowering education with Easy4U, where innovation meets accessibility. Our subscription-based offering not only equips schools with cutting-edge devices, but revolutionizes the learning experience by eliminating financial barriers, streamlining support, and embracing technology. We're not just providing tools, we're shaping a future where every student can thrive, unburdened by limitations. Easy4U, transforming education, one device at a time. Find out more at www.easy4u.school.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Reading Solutions UK. Are you looking for best practices and innovative strategies to foster confident, lifelong readers? Join the free online International Reading Conference on the 11th, 12th and 13th of June. Hear from speakers like TV personality and education expert Basit Siddiqui, beloved children's author Michael Rosen, fluency expert Tim Rosinski, EEF specialist Chloe Butlin, the National Literacy Trust's Irene Picton, and a range of experienced practitioners, including MAT leaders, deputy heads, heads of English, high-level teaching assistants, and school librarians. Through the 3-day conference, speakers will explore a range of topics at the forefront of the current educational landscape, with sessions relevant for all educators and key stages. Visit Reading Solutions at readingsolutionsuk.co.uk for more information and to sign up for this free conference.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
With the general election approaching, some political parties have already turned their attention to education. All major media outlets have covered Labour's plans to add VAT to private school fees, and the Conservatives' comments on increasing apprenticeships by getting rid of rip-off degrees. However, the BBC features a story on proposals by the Lib Dems to increase taxes on social media giants, as well as companies such as Amazon and Google. The revenue raised, the party says, would then be used to fund mental health professionals for all England state schools. The tax itself already exists and is known as the Digital Services Tax, but the Liberal Democrats say they would triple the amount the companies paid in it. Recent NHS statistics reported by the BBC show nearly 340,000 children and young people are currently on waiting lists to access mental health services in England. In response, the Conservatives said they'd already increased training places for mental health nurses, while Labour said it would put mental health support in every school. In Teesside, the BBC Tees news website reports on Nigerian students seeking help from a food charity. An economic crash in Nigeria has left international students at Teesside University struggling to afford tuition fees, with some even blocked from their studies and ordered to return home. The manager of Thornaby's Sprouts Community Food Charity spoke to BBC Local Radio and said 75% of their clients were now the struggling students and that it was at maximum capacity. The university itself said it was providing support and that international applicants must provide evidence of sufficient funds when applying for a student visa. Nigeria is currently experiencing its worst economic crisis in a generation. The value of its currency has been depreciating by more than 200% against the dollar. As a result, students at many UK universities have seen savings wiped out and budgets having to be significantly reduced. Some students at Teesside University have complained that the university's decision to change the payment plan and reduce instalments from 7 to 3 have exacerbated issues. The university is offering case-by-case support to those affected. In Northern Ireland, the TES reports that Education Minister Paul Givan has warned schools they must make school uniforms more affordable and that a price cap is being considered. He said the cost of uniform was an unnecessary burden on families by branded clothing and uniforms being available from only one supplier. Mr Givan said proposals due to go out for public consultation this spring will include strengthened guidance on the school uniforms. The decisions came in response to a motion in Stormont on making uniforms affordable. Mr Given said school uniforms create a sense of belonging to a school community, but that they should also act to ensure that pupils of all backgrounds feel welcome in the school. He went on to say that while many schools had followed current guidance around value for money, there are other schools which have not, and that this is not a situation which I am going to permit to continue. Further details on the proposals, which could also include the price cap, can be found in TES magazine online. Holiday prices feature in a Schools Week article on criticism faced by holiday company Butlins after it was accused of undermining schools' work to boost attendance. The criticism came after the company advertised term time breaks as great value getaways. The firm offers a 4-night midweek term time break for just under £20 per person, much cheaper than rates during school holidays. Schools Week reporters posed as parents and asked if the holidays were suitable for school-aged children, and were told all breaks are suitable for all ages. Ministers have pushed all year for schools to improve their attendance rates as persistence absence rates are nearly double pre-pandemic levels. Several multi-academy trust chief executives have commented that marketing holidays which specifically target term time is not civic-minded. but understood the attraction for families struggling to afford a family break, who were being exploited by the companies. Full details of the story are available on Schools Week's website. Finally, aposiopesis was the final word spelled correctly by 12-year-old Bruat Soma to win the 2024 Scripps National Spelling Bee in the USA. Soma takes home a $50,000 prize after spelling 29 words in 90 seconds and getting them all correct. For those of you who are curious, aposiopesis is a term used for the device of suddenly breaking off in speech. An example of this rhetorical device could be "get out or else," with the threat remaining unsaid. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
We've been talking a little bit, and I probably unfairly, I moved you very much onto my particular interest, which is the exams and so on. But you're a professor of cognitive psychology, and clearly retrieval of information and the understanding of how the brain works and so on is interesting to all of us in the sense that we're all on the receiving end of our own memories, in their strange, quirky forms. You can lose your keys when you walk in the door, but you can't remember where you put them. But I can remember a quotation from Shakespeare that I learned when I was 13. So that memory process and how you can fix things in your mind and use it effectively is really, I suppose, what you're mostly interested in. What does science say about the science of memory and information retrieval?
Yeah. So the best way, there's some very, very interesting research on mechanisms and what goes on internally when we retrieve memories. And it's fascinating. It's an area of research that really gets into, if you're very interested in theories and the brain, all of that stuff is there. There's the practical application of it, which kind of has to do with, well, based on what these mechanisms say is happening, how does this translate into what we do in the classroom specifically, and what kinds of retrieval activities we should design? So to give kind of a brief example, the mechanistic approach and the way researchers have kind of dug into that shows that retrieval of something from memory has to be complete, for lack of a better term. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you are going to try to retrieve something and you want the benefit of that experience where processes going on in the brain and the process of retrieval is truly a learning boosting event, what the research shows there is got to, have a little bit of exposure to the material, have something that you can retrieve. Maybe it was a lesson, it was a chapter that you read in a book, it was a teacher who introduced you to the material. Put it aside for a bit, let some time go by, like end of the day or even the next day, then try to retrieve what it is that did the day before. And the reason that is so effective is because the way that just processing information and forming memories works is, you take it in, it's kind of bits flying around, for lack of a better term. They don't really fly in your brain. They sort of go down your little axons and stuff, but it's information comes in, your brain processes it. It's sort of actively engaging with it. And while it's all still kind of up in the air, you don't want to, if you were to try to retrieve something literally right after somebody explained it to you, you would. Is that really retrieval? Or are you just able to sort of mimic or repeat just heard? Absolutely, you could get it right. In fact, if you had a teacher explain something to you or a process or a concept that was introduced to you, then you wait 30 seconds or a minute, and then you try to retrieve it. Probably you can. What's going on when you do that is the processes and the mechanisms are still kind of not quite settled yet. They're still active in your memory because you just heard about this or learned about this 2 minutes ago. What the research shows is that if you let all that settle, let it sort of soak in, so to speak. Let it get out of your immediate memory. That's why waiting a day, I always recommend wait a day. It's easy to work with schedules that way. Come back the next day. Your students, okay, what do you remember about this particular concept? They're going to be like, oh, I don't know. Yes, you do. You know something. It was just yesterday. So you do have to try. There's some effort involved. But that's what I mean by a complete, so to speak, retrieval attempt, where the information it has been received by your brain. It's been processed. Not all of it will be perfectly remembered, but some of it will. And so that process of retrieval is much more powerful because you're getting a complete boost from that process where you reactivate, so to speak, that knowledge that was explained to you or introduced to you, reactivate it, and you get the full strength of that mechanism compared to if you just tried to do it, 2 minutes after hearing something and it's easy, but it was already active at that point in time. So you don't get any boost to doing this process again.
So in a sense, it's making the knowledge your own. So you in retrieving it, you adapt it to your own way of thinking, or you have to turn it into your own set of language and words. And in that sense, you acquire the knowledge yourself, as opposed to, as you say, repeating things verbatim that you'd learned before.
Right. Yeah. And even if
you're
it's
using the knowledge.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. To use it to kind of put your own words to it is a very effective way to learn. Yeah. Even if it's just a purely memory based thing, like definitions or terms, there's a lot of those in education. Formulas for finding the volume of a figure in geometry. Anything we're trying to learn, if we come back and then we try to recall that process, we try to recall what was that information or that bit of knowledge or that biological process, and we start from a place where it's not fresh in memory, that's true memory retrieval. And it's hard. That's the process that sort of sometimes gets a reaction from a student or from a learner because they're not going to totally get it right. But that's where the magic is. That's where the retrieve what you can retrieve, figure out what's missing, figure out what you couldn't retrieve. And that is absolutely helpful for what you have to go back and revise and understand, okay, I got this part, but not this part. What do I have to do to get that part that I didn't get the first time?
I know I read an article recently, I think it was by a maths teacher, or math, as you said.
Yes, I just learned that recently. Yeah.
But this maths teacher was asserting that maths itself was essentially a subject can be divorced from the world, and that was fine. There was learning a lot of maths. If a student says to you, what's the use of this? What's it for? How will I use it in the world? So instead of he said, don't go down that road. Instead, enjoy the mathematics for its own sake. In other words, the complexity, its intricacy in itself. He said there's too tempting, this particular article writer said, too tempting for maths teachers to say, go out onto the field and let's see if we can measure the height of that church, or we can work out the volume of this particular swimming pool. He said, the practical element of maths, you're tempted to want to find that because it makes it relevant to the students. So what you have to do is instead divorce it from reality and accept it for what it is. And I thought, well, it's an interesting debate because when I was learning to be a teacher, trying to make things relevant to the students was considered quite important. You can show how that applies to you, how that would adapt to your world, or find the analogy of that thing now. So you study Shakespeare, you say Shakespeare's concerned with these sorts of things you might see in this, drama on television or your own lives, where you might read it, might see how this particular environmental concern, which is about something to do with the climate, might affect you. So trying to bring the generals to the particular, I was always taught, was quite important. So I don't know, in a sense, in that sense, because I think making it particular made it more available to someone to retain that knowledge. So I don't know whether, yes.
That's very common. I mean, at least for me, my experience was very similar. The things that I hear, from my colleagues every day who teach a number of classes, from the teachers I work with, that's quite common. I do it. Application matters. I mean, I'm saying that, based on an assumption, but it's sort of like where you're coming from. I think maybe this is this is kind of my take that I'm gonna mention. We definitely know that so from the motivation research that many folks are working with, what makes a student want to learn something, what causes them to be interested in something, that they want to partake and that they want to start learning something or continue learning something. We know that a significant contributor to that is the success they have with learning something. And is that related to application? That's a good question. If they were to start with something and just have a lot of difficulty and have trouble doing it right, and they feel they're trying, but they're just not getting it for whatever reason, that is a key contributor to whether students decide to continue putting effort into that. So in a roundabout way, I'm thinking, I don't know this, but I wonder if the application aspect is a way to make things a bit more concrete, a bit more, okay, here's how this actually works. Here's a way to make this more interesting, more of a reinforcing learning process.
Yes, and it strikes me that we're talking about also another thing I always thought was important in my teaching career was that that somehow you should make it enjoyable. I was rather guilty if I knew. I'd say to students, "This is a particularly dull topic." Apologize to them ahead of time, or I think to myself, "Well, good. I'm teaching such and such tomorrow. That's rather fun. I know how I'll make that enjoyable." Is emotion strongly linked to recall and learning? I mean, in terms of motivation, but also in terms of your reaction to it, even if you're slightly horrified by something, if it fixes itself in your mind that way, emotionally.
Motion is absolutely part of learning. There's a whole, there's a myriad of things that influence a learning experience for a student or even for an adult learner, for a child trying to learn something. One thing we know is extreme anxiety, extreme high anxiety where, and this can happen in schools. This can, experiences can lead to a state of mind or a state of the body where a student has had a negative can lead to students just being terrified to go to school, to go do math or to do whatever. High states of anxiety, another area of literature shows that interferes with learning. If a person is in a state where they're physiologically and mentally just absolutely negatively expecting something to happen, that sort of closes our ability to process information. Apply that to many experiences that many students have in schools, feeling like they're not learning well, like they're not smart, like they just can't do it. And then they sort of carry that forward with them, thinking, oh, I'm just not going to be successful at this. There's no magic bullet, so to speak. There's no quick fix to that. But one of the things I like about these strategies and techniques that come from cognitive psychology is, if we can get in early enough and teach, even when they're little children starting school, teach them about how to engage in the learning process, teach them how to question their own knowledge, and how doing so is not scary. It's not a stressful, terrible thing. It's a good thing to know what's in your knowledge, and discovering what's in your knowledge is the best thing, because then you know what it is to revise, what it is what it is that's solidly there and that's learned well, to make that just part of the everyday process. And this is how we do learning. And this is how we fail to remember some things. But look, when you fail to remember, you just revise it. And that's part of the process. It's, I think, not quite as normalized as it could be. And students, when they encounter a situation where they have difficulty learning something, maybe that's because they haven't done enough of that practice and early on to see, okay, what are the little bit about this that I'm having trouble learning? How, practicing it more to a point where you do better, you are more successful. I like these techniques. Again, not an ultimate fix to all the problems in education, but they're a step forward because you get a method that promotes success at learning. Students, the more they use these practice questions, the more they use these techniques, they do better and better and better at trying to remember information. So that's very reinforcing. That's if they feel they're going to get it right, then they want to do it. So that's another thing about the practice quizzes and practice questions. Students only don't like it if they think they're not going to totally get it right. If they think they know the answer, you can't get them to stop. They just want more. They want more. All the hands go up. They want to answer that question because they know it. It's very reinforcing to do well at something. And the way to get there is to practice.
I'll bet people listening to this will look back on their own school careers or their own university careers or any learning experience and say, well, the things I liked, what did I like best at school? And it will almost always coincide with things you thought you were good at. If you thought you were a bit of a star in that class or you liked that lesson. Also, you again, going back to what we were saying before, you'll, looking back on school, say, those were the lessons I enjoyed. Well, I enjoyed them because I felt I was good at them. But I enjoyed them because they were also an enjoyable experience. There was an element of fun or play, or the interaction with the teacher. Very often quite intimidating thing to think when you're a teacher. But if you like that teacher in the sense that you thought you trusted them, like they respected you and so on, if the atmosphere was correct, there was a degree of emotional element of delivery of knowledge. In other words, you can learn from people you like and respect much more than you can learn from people you don't trust. And as soon as that relationship breaks down, that's difficult to learn as well, because it's, as again, learning is so emotional. It's such a strong sense of identity attached to it. Who am I exactly? And if I don't want to discover that I'm not clever, then lost.
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up about how encouraging teacher can make such a difference. One of the things I think, and the research backs this up, part of the way to really get students to embrace and use these effective strategies like questioning, practice quizzes and that kind of a thing, they don't like it at first. I mean, that's a fair thing to say. That's an understatement. They don't like it because they don't feel they're going to do well at it. And what I have done in my own classes that I teach is one of the things I study is forgetting. And it's kind of funny. I study memory, I study forgetting. They're sort of one and the same. They're like the opposite of each other. But forgetting very specifically, I study by giving people information to learn, and then they learn it over and over and over. They do a lot of repetitions. They get to where they have absolute perfect ability to recall the information. And then everyone who's gotten to that point comes back at various different time intervals, and they take follow-up tests on the material after, say, 1 day, 7 days, 30 days, 60 days. And we plot out what performance looks like after they've learned something really, really well. How much do they remember after a day, after 2 days, after so many days? And if you kind of take your finger and just draw a line like a slope, like a ski slope, like a ski jump that goes down, it goes down very rapidly at first, and then it kind of tapers off and it levels out a little bit, where what we know about forgetting is that most of it happens very soon after learning something. You lose, and it's not a clear percentage in every single case because every material is a little bit different, but it's a large chunk of information. For example, you go to your class on a Friday and your teacher does a wonderful job explaining. She has you doing retrieval practice. You're doing all these things and you are really, really doing well at the end of class. You know everything as best as you can possibly know it. Probably by the next day, you're down to like a fraction of that stuff. And definitely by Monday, when you come back, you're down to even less of that information that has stayed in your memory. And that is absolutely normal. That's a process we all go through. You can't stop forgetting. It's just what your brain does. I like to demonstrate this by talking to my class or to different audiences about, forgetting is so powerful. Tell me what for dinner on January 15th of this year. And everyone's like, "Ugh," like they have no idea unless it was a special occasion or something. Tell me the last thing your kid said before they went to school on Monday. They're like, "Oh," or, even, important things or semi-important things that we just don't hold on to every little thing in our brain. And it's very adaptive. If we did, we would have so much interference all the time, we couldn't function. So forgetting, I say that to make the point that talking to students about these techniques and how to be a better learner, one of the things I've had great success with is showing them this research on forgetting and doing these little demonstrations on look how hard it is to just retain knowledge. And this is normal. It's not like there's anything wrong with you. This is what everybody does. And so I tell them, I'm going to have you practice with retrieval, these concepts that you're learning. You're not going to get it right every time. And here's why. Your brain just very naturally doesn't hang on to all this information. Our job, as we use retrieval practice to try to be better learners, is to figure out where that information is in our brain. Take a little test, a little sample of what's in my brain right now. I forgot that information. Okay, got to put that back. Got to practice that again to put that back. A week later, you take another little sample. Okay, I got this right. I got it more correct this time, but I missed this little bit. Got to put that back. Okay, so that's what retrieval is. It's not this high stakes, want to see what you get wrong. It's a check so that you know what to do next.
Is there any sort of research or understanding of what we retain? You say after a while, you lose a lot very quickly. You said at the beginning of a lecture, you can remember the first 5 minutes, but you're forgetting quite quickly as you come out of the lecture and so on. But years later, you might say, well, I did a degree in history, or I did a big study of such and such a thing. Or I wrote a PhD. I was talking to someone who did a PhD in philosophy the other day. And I said, oh, yes, fascinating. He said, yeah, it took me 6 years, that PhD. But, there's a lot of it I've forgotten. And I thought, well, yes, but is there a structure that you'll never forget? The sort of big picture. So you may forget the details. You can't now quote that study. You can't remember that particular fact. But you do know the broad understanding. So if someone said to you, well, you studied the First World War, you know the big picture and you'll never forget that. You understand it as a sort of, as a pattern, but you've lost the detail. So in that sense, is our long-term memory about having a scaffolding which we can later on put back the bits we've forgotten?
Yeah, great question. The research on forgetting shows us everything is subject to forgetting. Stuff you've learned better is forgotten less. Simply, because you've spent more time with it, you've really dug in very deeply, and you've spent an intimate amount of time. I'm thinking about my own dissertation, for example. I can probably sit here and tell you most of what that study involved, maybe not all of it, but I worked on other studies too when I was a PhD student, and those would not be as memorable because my dissertation was the one where, for better or for worse, it was like a long-term relationship where I just had this project that was my all hours of my day for years. So absolutely depends on, how solid that information is to begin with. So information, no matter how well it's learned, tends to be forgotten. The studies I'm thinking of are these wonderful studies where this scientist named Harry Barrick at Ohio Wesleyan University did very, very long-term studies on forgetting. And he did it in this clever way where the university had a reunion every year where students came back. And it was a big deal. They were a very close-knit community. And so a lot of students came back to attend this reunion. And he was a memory scientist, and he took advantage of this. And so he gave them tests over the stuff that they learned and their classes. And did they remember the classes that they took? Did they remember various details? Did it depend on what sort of grade they earned or what sort of mark they earned in the class? And he went out to like 50 years post graduation and found that, yes, that forgetting curve still applies, mostly within the first handful of years. So people they remember things better a year after graduation than 5 years after graduation and so on. But a lot of stuff is still forgotten. Some stuff, you reach a point, what his research also showed that was really cool is you reach a point where you don't forget any further, where that information is sort of solid, so to speak. And he called it permastore, like are believed to be permanently stored in memory, but they're still forgotten more after, years compared to after a brief amount of time. So the question of do you hang on to some types of information better than other types of information? I think yes, absolutely. If there's a way that they've been learned over time, very solidly. But what we know about forgetting from the scientific studies is everything is subject to forgetting if you don't constantly do something with it.
Well, Shana, we're coming to the end now, so I've just got one last thought to go down, and that is that one thing that has happened in my teaching career, and in the last few years, it seems to be an accelerating process, is things like the internet and social media and so on. And these are great tools for learning, but they're also highly distracting. Learning must have been a very different process for our ancestors in a much less jumbled up sort of world, confusing sort of world. People often say that we've never lived with so much information and so found it so difficult to discern which bits are important. So is there any sort of research in the effects of our contemporary information-laden society on forgetting and learning? Has it become more difficult?
You mean just today in general compared to the internet days?
For instance, there's so much information. I could now tap into anything that we might have just talked about and say, well, I have to find out some more about that and probably find a lecture on it. So they say, well, I must live in an enormously learning-rich environment. Very difficult to forget anything. But also, I'm surrounded by bombarding stimulus. It must push a lot of things aside.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Absolutely, these changes have occurred very where you're right. You can pretty much look up anything. Now, what you're going to find is kind of, not always certain of whether it's going to be accurate or complete. But students certainly have options nowadays for things that they can just look for on the internet and things that they can see on their own that just did not exist decades ago for students in school or for people in general. One thing that's important in all these changing times as things are rapidly increasing in certain ways is to remember the human brain is pretty much still what it is. What it has been for, 10,000 years or so. I wasn't there back then to do studies, but the folks who look at that sort of thing anthropologically say, the structure, the basic architecture and anatomy is quite similar, quite the same. The way we process information with our brains is limited. It always will be. We can't take in everything all at once and remember it because we're limited by our attentional abilities. So if you walk into a room and there's like 20 things going on and I say, okay, look at all stuff. And then you leave the room and then you try to remember all that stuff, it will be impossible because you only remember what you visually focus on, what you attentively engage with. So every minute, every day that you're in your life doing things, your window of attention is moment by moment limiting what's even going to get in to your memory to the point where probably 90% of what's happening around you never even gets in to your conscious awareness because you can only attend to so many things at a time. So that's important to know. The way we process information and the way that we learn has not changed for as long as we've had the brain anatomy that we've had for lots and lots of years. I think that's important to keep in mind. I do hear sometimes people talk about, oh, this is a new way that we learn now, or students don't learn the way they used to learn. I always want to know more about, okay, what do you mean by that? Because really, the scientific aspect of how we process information and how we learn would suggest, no, we do process and learn very similarly. Now, when there are distractions, absolutely, that takes away. Like you have a harder time attending to something when you have distractions around you. If I put 20 things in a room and one of them is a really cute little puppy dog, and I say, no, you were supposed to pay attention to all the other things, not the puppy dog. Like it's harder. And so sources of distraction are probably going to create more potential for interference, and the sorting through and being able to process information in the face of distractions when other things are competing for your attention, I would say probably does make it more challenging. Now, that's not to say that, 30 years ago, students didn't have other ways of zoning out and not paying attention. They probably did, but it wasn't right at their fingertips like it is now. It was a little harder to access. But the basics of, how to learn things, how to engage in learning in a way that is effective, to kind of follow these principles and have these activities and lessons with practice questions that are, kind of spaced in time across days, absolutely still works.
Yeah.
I think, to have a bit of discipline with kind of being able to kind of shed the distractions while this is being done. Absolutely. You don't want the students, engaging in retrieval practice while they're looking at Instagram or whatever. That totally takes away from the process of learning.
Yes.
And so to do it in a distraction-free setting is absolutely key. That's when it works.
Yes. The my last thought to you, Charlotte, is that all the way through my teaching career, I and my own learning, I used to emphasize to students, the need to find a good learning environment when you're studying, a quiet place where you can get to grips with it. And then I had the experience of my own daughters who came through school. I actually went to the school I was teaching at the time, and I would watch them from the other side. I could see them coming home to do homework, and they would put on earphones and they play music. I said, I can't understand it. I said, you cannot possibly work with music and listen at the same time. And they assured me they could, and they did, and they did very well at school. Just to prove me wrong. So, Charlie, do you have to have silence, or can you listen to music?
Oh, that's a good question. There is some work on that. There is some research on that. And I think that the take-home message from that is whether something is going on in your environment while you're trying to learn something depends greatly on whether that thing is a source of distraction or not. So, if it's music that's kind of soothing, that's kind of instrumental, that allows you to focus on what you're doing, that doesn't get in the way. Let's say you're trying to retrieve something about European history, and you're using kind of verbal information. You're doing retrieval practice. You're constructing a thought. If that music doesn't get in the way of that, but it's just kind of there, but it just sort of calms you and it sort of helps you feel more relaxed. Now, the different sort of example would be if the music has verbal lyrics and you really, really like that song and you want to sing along to it, and that's kind of tempting you every second that you're trying to do recall, that would be distracting. You're singing the song instead of retrieving from memory. So the research on distractions, not just music, but also other things with like multitasking studies that people are given to do, depends on the potential for that second task to take up resources that you're trying to use to do the first task, which is studying or retrieving.
Yes, Sienna, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for this discussion. I very much enjoyed it. I'm glad the internet was kind to us in the end. And I've learned a lot.
Thank you.
And that brings to an end this episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. That was the recording of an interview I made a few weeks ago with Professor Shana Carpenter from Oregon State University. We were talking about recall and learning and the science of learning. And as I sat here listening to the interview again and reminding myself of some of the things we talked about, one point she said stood out for me. When Shana pointed out that the appearance of knowing something is rather different from actually knowing it. It's when you try to use something or explain it that you exhibit whether you know it not only to other people but yourself. When I was at school, this would be in the early 1960s, that's primary school this is, early primary school, in year 2 or 3 or so, I'd arrived at the age of 5 years old and was unable to read. But my teachers didn't know. It was a perfectly good primary school. My parents, though, had observed that when they were trying to read with me and read together, I simply couldn't make out a word. And I was getting on, as I say, for 5 years old. My mum went to the school and complained, and was assured by the head teacher, and indeed the class teacher, that there was no one in that particular class who couldn't read. Though I was a slow reader, I was a reader. It turned out, of course, a phenomenon familiar to early years teachers, that I was very quick at being able to observe what pictures meant, to pick up the clues from the reader as they encouraged me, and to listen to what others were saying, and to give every impression of being able to read, if falteringly. The head teacher intervened and took me for classes with 1 or 2 other students who were struggling, and within a really short period of time, as I remember it, possibly a term, I was a fluent reader. It had simply become easier to pretend to read than to actually read. I hope you enjoyed the discussion with Dr. Carpenter. I did. I learned a lot. And as I continue to explore what schools are for. If you wish to listen to this again on Teachers Talk Radio, the website, or on Spotify, you can find it recorded there. Thank you for listening. Join me again in 2 weeks' time.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.